across the globe, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I think what this symposium is about is creating spaces for our international community to come together virtually for creating the restoration of Indigenous dispute resolution practices. So it's a topic which is really huge, mediation and Indigenous conflict resolution practices. I think it's like the Indian folktale of the blind man and the elephant, a little bit of that. Many speakers across the globe have shared their views about how they see this elephant from different angles. But what it allowed us, and I was listening almost not live, but recordings, most of the speakers, has created cultural awareness by showing different perspectives, how it leads to distinct point of views, and still how we are all interconnected. I was listening to John's presentation and how you both stumbled upon a similar aspect being followed in India and in Canadian tribes. And I think those are really treasure moments where we find that interconnectedness. And I think I love the saying that we see the world as we are, and to learn the truth and how we can understand the Indigenous people's cultural perspectives, their life experiences. I think we have to understand the holistic approach. And what you have created here is unfolding that holistic approach bit by bit. Many Indigenous speakers came and shared their wisdom, their worldview, and it was very heartening to listen to some of their stories, their personal stories. Like Ipe was talking about how he was talking about his mother, and she came from an island which vanished with the environmental impacts, and you know, people's experiences of loss of land, how that experience shapes them, and how we understand that. So it was a wonderful, and it is a learning opportunity for all of us, and to connect it with how I see it with the kind of work that I do. I think it's an opportunity to understand the diversity, and it urges all of us as practitioners to be consciously inclusive, because there are intersectional identities that we all carry, and it impacts how the dispute resolution system or conflict resolution system understands those identities, and the problem solving happens around that. So it is so humbling to listen to the life stories and to learn how these people have learned about the impact of culture and even the intergenerational trauma. So I think this is how I see the symposium, and much more, of course. And we are living in a polarized world. So we have to learn and adapt. We have to learn so much from Indigenous peoples. I just want to share one little anecdote that I heard from a speaker who was actually sharing something on the radio about the Indigenous practices. And respect of nature is one key aspect of it. So if I have to pluck even a small leaf from a tree, I have to ask permission. And in exchange of that leaf, I can offer my hair. And, you know, it was like so touching. These are small things, but it speaks about the life, nature, and our connection. So, you know, these concepts of peace and harmony that we have understood from Indigenous practices is huge. So I think it is a new understanding of fairness, justice. Again, the differences between, as people sometimes say, what is legal system and what is justice system? You know, these are two different things. So I think what we are talking about is going beyond justice and finding healing, finding reconciliation, and how we understand how we can repair our relationships with the Indigenous people. Frankly, we can't fix what we don't understand. So I come from a place of learning. We could talk about why the current system is not working, and how we can redesign that. So I think the key message I have heard from the speakers who have come before, and I'm sure the ones who would come after me, is we have to break down the silos. And I think the symposium is being a platform for doing that. So I think that's how I see this. And this is a very important work. I think that it was much needed and quite timely. So that's how
Really
I see
nice.
it, Vikram.
Amazing, Archana, that what you said, I'm just thinking, is this what I've created?
Yes, you have.
Oh, but I think it's still what is a starting point. The discussions have happened. The next one next year, we'll have a much larger one. Let's get voices from every corner. So I'll start that process early because I put this out a little late. I mean, I just felt that like the conference was going on, so let's not mix it with the conference. Let's announce it after that. So there was short of time, but people have come in, so that's nice. So next one we'll do. I would want from every part of the world, every corner. Let's get voices. How big it becomes doesn't matter. Let's make it as big as we can. So thank you very much. Really nice words. What I will put out there is, of course, I mean, in terms of, because what you said about the healing part of it, this is that mediatorvikram.com. Why I put that out is because here you can find detail. There's so much work out there. I mean, of course, lots of content on YouTube, so you'll find details there. But this World Mediation Circle, which I'm sure, I don't know whether you read about it, the idea being, let's create, and we're learning from this symposium from people as to how we can create a mediation circle, which is the large one, the world one, and then every country, every community, every school will have that. So that is where the humanistic approach, the healing, the collaborativeness, all that comes in. So that's the kind of mediation we need to develop. Whatever happens, I mean, I won't get into, because I do have lots to say when I talk about the court system and all that. I'm not going to touch it, but there is the other world that we have to create. So details are here on that mediatorvikram.com, and schedule of activities is here. So on this, you'll find the schedule of the symposium, which has the YouTube links and the details of the speakers. I will not take more of your time. So Archana, about you and the topic, and like, I'll only come in when you want me to come in. Please.
Okay, so about myself, I think you will know me as I speak, but just as a brief introduction, I would say that I wear lots of hats. I would say that to start with, in the context of this symposium, I'm a settler. I was born in India. I immigrated to Canada from India a few years ago, a few decades ago now, but I see myself as an ally of Indigenous people. And I think that today I'm not an expert in this topic, but I can connect my world with the understanding of the Indigenous peoples. And again, my learning from the Indigenous dispute resolution practices is what brings me here. So I think that I wanted to understand Canada's Indigenous peoples and principles as connecting parts of the world. When I left India, how I felt there was a vacuum. There was this weird feeling of losing something, and I didn't know at the time what that was. And it was a lot of leaving my dear ones behind. It was a choice that I came to Canada, so I was not forced. But I still could connect as I started learning about Indigenous dispute resolution practices, that it gave me a new meaning, that loss of land. Of course, it was not in the context that Indigenous people understand and live with. But I think that connected the dots for me, that the experiences, we can be more attuned to the feeling of loss, because this is something similar. The reason is different, and the context, of course, is different. By profession, I am a lawyer. I have worked in adversarial system for almost all my life. And I can say that there is a little bit of personal anecdote that I can share. There were two people in my life in early on times who shaped some of the things around my advocacy. And I actually see this work of mediation to be advocated as a process part of extension of what I did. So I don't really see that as two different compartments, frankly. I see that what we are doing now is advocating for mediation as a process. We want that the adversarial system has to adapt to so much that people are asking for from the ground. And my work has actually connected how we can redesign the current systems that would be more inclusive, that would have more of voices of Indigenous dispute resolution practices. So that's one part of it. Of course, I'm a mediator and peace builder. I volunteer for organization Mediators Beyond Borders International, which was founded by, as I say, my mediation guru, Ken Cloke. And of course, his initial speech, the keynote for the symposium was, of course, so much to learn from. And he did so much of foundation of all our learning and humbling aspects of it. So I would say two things, and then I would like to dive into the topic. I was born in post-colonial India, or I would say independent India, and it shaped me in a certain way. My elder uncle was a freedom fighter, and I think that shaped our family values. Advocacy was in our blood, I think, and I could see that there were lots of narratives around the freedom struggle of India that we lived in the house. We had people coming in all walks of life, and their experiences, their pain, suffering, or their passion, motivation, all of that shaped me. The other one, which is I didn't understand at the time, my cousin, Kavita Mahajan, who was a very well-known writer in Maharashtra, who passed away a couple of years ago, but we were very close. And her work, of course, she was a Marathi writer, but part of her work was, she was in Thane, which is part of Maharashtra. And she started working with the tribes around Thane, which is, of course, India's indigenous people, Varlis and Thakurs. And she collected the Varli folk songs. She collected the songs written by tribal volunteers, and then Sahitya Academy published her Encyclopedia of Tribal Communities in Maharashtra, which was a huge work. And talking to her, I was young at the time, not realizing what her work was all about. And it was seen in the literary sense, right? It was not in the space of legal arena. But then the stories that I heard from her, and she would go by walk from one Adivasi Pada to the other to do all her work. And she was quite young at the time. She would come back and share the stories of deprivation and people's struggles to have basic needs met. And I started seeing unconsciously that these are all issues which connect very closely to human rights. And what was very passionate topic that emerged, and I'm going to talk about it today as we discussed, is the right of self-determination of Indigenous peoples. It is really crucial because how this system was designed, either say in India or Canada or everywhere in the world, the formal legal system, when it was designed, these voices were not really heard. And that's why what we have today is not satisfactory, or it's not really bringing everyone's understanding. And I think Gandhiji's Satyagraha, the concept, of course, I'm just going to connect how it shaped my framework for working, is I understood about power imbalances, and we can look at the world in many angles, but my work and my study about law has been driven by understanding inequality and power imbalances. So speaking truth to the power, I think that's what Satyagraha is. And how can we bring that into our processes? By creating safe space and mediation, by, as Ken says, being omnipartial and understanding people's power differentials is really crucial. So I think what Indigenous practices in conflict resolution are teaching us is to promote dialogue amongst the parties. And India is a pluralistic society, and it shaped my worldview. It didn't leave me as soon as I left India. So I came to Canada, and of course, there is this concept of multiculturalism in Canada. And I think that I learned constitutional law. That's my focus of my work and studies in law. So I think that that's been my foundation. And I want to draw from that as I speak with you today. And I think what Indigenous practices and its learning has done to me is it has actually broadened my heart. To first of all, to say that it's probably very cheesy to say that, but it was liberating my spirit. I can say that, of course, the constitutional law and sections and comparison of various constitutions and how we come about by understanding justice and fairness, and how do we actually have principles of resolving disputes and conflicts, and how we are going to govern. All of that is in the Constitution. But there is this one seventh generation principle. I'm sure you have heard about that. It's an ancient Haudenosaunee philosophy from one of the Indigenous communities in Canada. And this philosophy says that when we make today's decision, we have to ensure that whatever is the result, it has to sustain for 7 generations. And I stopped and stumbled, and I said, do we really see that far when we make decisions? And no, we don't. We are very short-sighted. We see the world around us. We see people around us, our dear ones, near ones, maybe our clients, maybe a little bit of our community. But how wider can we get? And I think it is the going beyond the self-interest and looking at the bigger picture is what is the key that I actually understood from the Indigenous practices. And did you want to say something?
No, perfect. I'm listening.
Okay. All right. So I think as you have handed it over to me, I'm going to again draw from Ken's learnings that I have to kind of build the foundation. And there are 3 parts, he says, for conflict resolution. It's very lovely, and it always helps me kind of ground myself in understanding what I'm doing consciously as a mediator. So he says there is one path which is moving backwards, which is looking at the adversarial part of the relationship, or the stress in relationship, or the impasse that the parties are locked and there is no way going anywhere but going backwards. The other one is to move forward, which is then looking at resolution, looking at collaborating in the relationship aspects. And the third one, which is most challenging one in practice, it's easier to understand, is moving deeper into the heart of the conflict. And it's basically challenges us as a professional to evolve, to learn, and to transform. And if we understand the conflict from going to the heart of the conflict, then what we serve in terms of our clients, our roles as mediators, could be deeper. It would allow people in conflict to choose how their attitude towards past, present, or future is going to be defined. So I always think that it's quite interesting to draw from Ken's teachings and then connect it with the Indigenous dispute resolution or IDR practices, and see that how our worlds can connect and our understanding can deepen. So how I have seen conflict, a very simple definition a friend of mine shared and stuck with me, is it's a simple word, simple way of looking at it. It's the delta between where we should be and where we are. So with connecting this with the Indigenous practices, where we should be, what we should have known by now, and where we are, that's creating conflict in some sense. And that's where the concept of reconciliation comes up. We acknowledging that we have so much to learn from and adapting to it. Because if we know more about certain things that we think is helping people, it's actually anecdotally people have said that it's hurting them, or it's superficial aspects of it. So I think what I want to focus today is how I approach conflict within legal framework. I know that we're talking about mediation, but I think that the world, how it is set up, and what means to be reconciliation and rebuilding of relationships between the state and Indigenous people's right of self-determination. So I want to take it from the angle of law more than mediation, but I want to situate mediation in the arena of legal rights, in arena of human rights. And as I said, I'm a lawyer, but my human spirit was liberated with these practices. So I think that how can we take as a human-centered approach to conflict resolution is what is the key. So my key aspect about learning various processes, including the idea practices, is every process has its own strengths and limitations. So for us, what we need to look at as a professional is process is a means, it's not a goal. And I think that I don't want to really conclude, but to paraphrase what the Singapore Convention is telling us as definition about the process is, as long as people reach amicable settlement with a third party who does not have power to impose the decisions on them or being evaluative or as a judge making decisions for them, that process is the process. Whether you call it as mediation, facilitation, or something else, conciliation, I think it is immaterial at one point. And that's why I think what it's asking us, urging us to do is to keep that human-centric approach. And how we can do that, I have been studying. I actually went back to school last 2 years. I was doing my second master's degree in dispute resolution. And I was really working on various processes. And I think that what we could do is develop a hybrid process, which is inclusive, which kind of be, we want to maybe not work with the existing system, but that's not a reality. So we have to redesign the current system and make it inclusive. And how can we do that is what some of the ideas, and that's where the concept of the indigenous concept of justice that heals, the restorative aspect of it needs to be brought into our mainstream litigation spaces. And we can change that. We can change the culture. We can change the processes. People whose voice was not heard as these systems were designed can be brought back to the table, and we can do it. So it's not necessary that we need to absolutely dismantle everything and say we don't want to be part of it. But I think we can make it more inclusive. And I would give the example, you talked about mediation circle. So I want to connect the concept of circle to our judicial system as an example about what I'm talking about. So who decided how the court sits, where the judge has to be on the top and the staff and then 2 counsel tables? Why can't we have circles in the courtroom? Why can't we open up that space, allow the elders to come and participating people, if they believe in the ceremonies? Why can't these things be brought into the spaces where there happens a discussion about people's dispute resolution? And if for people who are participating, someone other than just the parties is important to resolve, why can't they be part of all of that? And these are the questions. So the circles have already been introduced in the justice system. In Canada, it was in the context of sentencing in criminal courts. And now we are seeing that a lot of Indigenous practices are brought into the child welfare arena. And then I have seen, and there is in Alberta, there is a new court sitting where they would be following Indigenous practices. So we are starting to see the change, and it's possible. So we can actually develop this hybrid justice system where we can bring these concepts and bring the understanding of the effect of colonization. And I know you have been talking about this concept with a lot of people, but when I studied the Indian Constitution, I know that there is a recognition of concept of legal pluralism in Indian Constitution. And as I said, the Canadian Constitution looks at it from multiculturalism aspect. So the question is, how do we look at the unitary system, which is a legislative process. The law is written and it defines how the justice system works, versus the indigenous law, which is based on the sources such as custom, songs, stories, language, ceremonies. So do they always have to be in conflict, or can they actually coexist? And that's the concept of legal pluralism. There are lots of scholars, but Sally Mary was the one who defined what legal pluralism means. And it is actually the situation in which two or more legal systems can coexist at the same time. And that's happened in the past, as many speakers before me have alluded to, that before we had codified law, before we had the formal justice system, there were a lot of other systems in existence, which were not necessarily based on the written unitary system. And it worked. People coexisted. But rather than going back, can we draw from those experiences and what worked and why it worked and make the current system better? Because I think what we're talking about is reconciliation. So for us as mediators and conflict resolution practitioners, which is a bigger umbrella, is to understand this legal pluralism and reconciliation. I think in Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would like to talk about some of the key aspects of that, if that's okay. But the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has actually recommended that we have to look at reconciliation in many ways. And it has actually made a recommendation that we have to establish respectful relationship and revitalize the Indigenous law. And that's the path I want to explore today, how we can do that, because there are legal traditions in Indigenous practices as well. They were not termed as legal, but they had a system of resolving disputes. And those traditions brought into the legal system, mainstream legal system, is a way of looking at reconciliation. So if we want to focus our understanding to use of the court system as means to work of regaining the power of self-determination, it's basically to kind of recognizing the legal institution and path within the Indigenous understanding. So there are lots of scholars working in Canada around this issue, but there is one Canadian legal scholar I would really encourage people to look up a couple of his books. His name is Professor John Burroughs, and he has done a lot of work around the colonial construct of law and how Canada's constitution can make it itself broader by accepting the Indigenous legal traditions. So he has talked about multi-juridical legal culture. It's a concept that he has described, and he's written 2 books. I'm just going to cite the books because I think we have limited time today, but Canada's Indigenous Constitution, amazing book. He's written it a few years ago. And recently, I think it was during the pandemic or just before, he talks laws, Indigenous ethics. Very interesting concepts that he talks about. And I think that the interaction between the Canadian state law and Indigenous legal traditions is what he combines. And that legal framework to bridge the gap of our understanding of conflict and being inclusive is the key. So I think that what we are looking at the end is peace, right? So there is always a paradox of peace and even human condition, that To achieve peace, we have to fight for it. So how Indigenous peoples across the world are fighting for understanding of their cultures to be the key foundation of how they can decide what they want. And we have seen that just looking at a little bit of statistics, and I'm not going into the numbers, but it's interesting to see sometimes what the numbers are telling us. And what we are doing to so many people is there are estimated 476 million Indigenous peoples in the world, and they are spread across 90 countries. And they make up less than 5% of world's population, but account for 15% of the poorest. And that's not fair. And what we are doing is leaving people behind. And I work on the UN system where we are focused on the SDGs. And we have taken a pledge in the world that by 2030 will not leave anyone behind. So what you're doing today by bringing everyone in this symposium is to think about how can we not leave Indigenous people behind? How can we bring them into the mainstream of bringing their various types of rights into the mainstream aspects? And the loss of land or protecting their other rights has been the key aspect that has really challenged their even identities and how their right to traditional land, territories, or natural resources has been challenged throughout the history, and their rights have been violated. So it creates disadvantageous position and it makes them vulnerable. So we as international community have to take measures to protect these rights and maintain their culture. We all have to be part of the solution. So I want to take a very brief overview of what's happening in Canada and just milestones. I'm not going into the law, but just some things that have happened around last few years, which has changed or shifted the conversation. So I'm not going into anything political, but I think it's important to see these milestones as what is happening as the historic events taking place in terms of Indigenous rights. So
but
just
remember,
last...
you're saying rushing it, we don't have time, and be brief. We have time. We have time. Look, Jim's session starts at my 7:30. So we have another hour. I don't know about your schedule, but we have another hour. So you can take, these are very important things that you're putting out there. So take your time. I'm saying don't have to rush it. It's not up till 7 o'clock my time. It's up till 7:30. You have time.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to then not skip some of the thoughts that I have, and let's see how I can do this. Okay, so going back to what's happening in Canada, because sometimes it's crucial to see, and many people have presented what's happening in Australia and what's happening in Brazil and many other parts of the world. So last Friday, literally this week actually, just there was a weekend in between, our Prime Minister announced nomination of the first Indigenous person to serve on the Canada Supreme Court. So Michelle O'Batswin is the first Supreme Court Canada nominee to be a judge. And it's a huge next step in Canada's reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And there has been a lot of understanding of how does the decision maker looks like, because their experiences are going to shape their decision making. So not having the Indigenous judge appointed as the apex court was always a concern expressed. So this has happened. So let's see how it all started. It goes back all the way to 2008 when there was a formal apology from the federal government in its role for forcibly removing Indigenous children from their homes and keeping them in what it was called as residential schools. And you won't believe it, but the last residential school closed in 1990s. So although it started, it was almost more than a century that these residential schools literally wiped out the Indigenous traditions, languages, culture, and it has really impacted not one, but actually few generations around their understanding of how do they see their families, communities, and children. So a lot has happened in relation to the children and child welfare in Canada. And then there was this apology, and it followed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'll call it as TRC. It was established in 2008, and it was actually there was an agreement, which we call it as Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and it was reached in 2006, and the courts approved in 2007. So it's interesting why I'm sharing this is because the path for establishing certain rights could sometimes be through the justice system, through the rights being asserted. So the federal government entered into negotiations, and I'm in Ontario. The Ontario Court of Appeal approved a class action lawsuit, and Indian residential school survivors have gone to the court against the federal government, and that's how the TRC ultimately came into establishment. I mean, not exactly why, but a combination of these things. So there is a lot of push happening around the understanding of what needs to happen. The survivors' voices have to be heard. So TRC was established, and it was guided by the traditional Indigenous knowledge and practices. And there is, you heard from John, he comes from Anishinaabe tribe. So actually, Anishinaabe has 7 grandfather teachings, and those are respect, courage, love, truth, humility, honesty, and wisdom. So now this becomes the parameter of the TRC's work. And I am trying to draw the parallels of how the legislative framework would work. But this TRC's framework is set by the Anishinaabe teachings. So it is not existing in vacuum. It is actually creating foundation, which is so large, so big, and it opens up your heart. Just listening to these words, not even going into the practices, you can see that how it would have opened up a lot of wounds and spaces for ultimate healing. And that's basically, it worked for 6 years. It heard thousands of residential school survivors. There were, I think, 7 national ceremonies. And then ultimately, 2015, there was a report from the TRC, which recommended the action items for the government. So fast forward in, again, April 2022, the Indigenous leaders traveled to Vatican, and they visited the Pope. And that's the milestone that the Pope, Francis, apologized to the Canadian Indigenous delegation for the church's role in the residential school system. And these schools were operated, as I said, for almost a century. And what it did was it destroyed the culture, because the children didn't know how to speak their own language. And it was not few years, it was few decades. And the estimation is that almost 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend these residential schools. So there was a lot of neglect and abuse of these children. And you might have heard the stories of now Canada discovering unmarked graves of these children. It's very humbling, it's very painful, but it's real. And the community was grieving. And this apology has opened up a new conversation. The other aspect was that in July, just literally a few weeks ago, the Pope visited Canada, and then he apologized to Indigenous people. And there was quite an emotional event, rather than what he said and how it happened. I was watching how the ceremony was designed, and there were 5 TPs, these Indigenous TPs. So they had 5 of those. And usually they would have 4, which represent the notions of the land. So there are east, west, north, south understanding. But there was a 5th one, which was symbolic to the entrance to the former school. And it was very symbolic, but it was very touching at the same time. So there is a lot of response that needs to take place as reconciliation has to happen. So if we look at what is happening besides the residential school is loss of land. We talked about that. And that is the pain point, or that has been the trauma of Indigenous peoples, losing their land. So how do we see that from legal perspective is very important to understand. So there was a doctrine of discovery, which is actually, it originated into the 15th century edicts of the Pope. And that's how things happened at the time. It's very important to Indigenous peoples from Canada, but US, South America, and Australia to a certain extent, because this doctrine of discovery from, say, 1400s, it gave blessing to European colonizers to seize the land, which was not inhabited by Christians. And it ultimately now connects with the claims that Indigenous peoples are doing in legal system to claim the right over their land and the resources. And I think that we have to look at that as the impact of how colonization came into existence and how people's real loss of land has impacted. That should be the starting point of reconciliation as well, right? Because we all have to act. We need to come from a place of learning and dialogue because the loss is real. And I think that the TRC's report that I'm talking about gave some of the guidance, but what it talks about is nation to nation relationship, Indigenous nation to Canadian nation relationship. And that's how recognizing the rights, respecting and cooperating with Indigenous peoples is important. So if we want to look at another aspect, and I think that we have to understand when whichever process we are dealing with Indigenous peoples, the impact of intergenerational trauma. And what is this? It's sometimes not very known and conscious, and sometimes it's ignored. But particularly in the communities in Canada, the residential school survivors, and even the fact that residential schools existed for such a long time, brought a lot of negative energy. And that is the stemming part of the intergenerational trauma. So we have to understand there is an impact of emotional, psychological, social, and even spiritual wounds for people. And it actually spans across generations, and it's a group trauma. It's not an individual that has happened. It has happened to a group. It's a collective. And you would hear maybe from Jim, but this is what I have learned from him, that there is a concept of ethno stress. So we have to understand what is ethno stress. It's actually disrupting the Aboriginal spirit. What colonization did, what these structures that were created that took away a lot of joy of Indigenous peoples is when people's cultural beliefs and joyful identity is disrupted. And that's exactly what happened. The interfering into their understanding of what they wanted, what their need was, such as simple as feeling safe and secure, or peace building, or just existing, was not made easy. People didn't have hope, and they actually did not see that their land rights, their resources, or even their practices around that were not acknowledged. Sometimes people don't see and appreciate what they have to offer. And I think our communication, how we communicate with them, has to acknowledge all these things. So I think that I want to look at the sources of Indigenous rights in Canada. I'm not going in details, but there are three things which the Indigenous peoples traditionally pointed that there are three principles. One is international law. It's very important. And I know that when you post this symposium concept, you talked about the UN Declaration, and you talked about its framework. And that's actually has been a huge push to understand the international law in the context of its impact on Indigenous peoples, and a lot of things, and I'm going a little deeper in the declaration, how it impacts the self-determination aspect of it. There is a royal proclamation as the second thing, where there are various treaties that the governments have signed with Indigenous peoples. And then, as you would understand, being in India, and I come from India, that there are common law traditions which the courts define. So these are three spaces in which there is conversation happening around recognition of Indigenous rights to self-determination. So it actually spans a lot of things. And I want to name it just so that we can visualize what we mean by self-determination or self-government. It's about land, it's about equality, it's about language, and it's all about basic human rights. So the UN Declaration, Canada signed in 2016. It's interesting to see that initially Canada did not sign because there were concerns regarding the land disputes and how the declaration would impact. There was a duty to consult with Indigenous peoples and how it would impact the decision around land disputes. So going back to the Canada's constitution, there were lots of discussions around how to define Indigenous legal rights. So Section 35 of Constitution Act in 1982, when Canada repatriated, so it's almost like a legal liberation of Canada because it was ruled by British, like Canada is, like India was. But repatriation was kind of claiming the ownership of our own governance. And that's basically what repatriation was. But we, as Canada, repatriated the Constitution, but then how did we define the Indigenous rights within that Constitution is a very interesting dynamics. And Supreme Court of Canada has clarified and has given a lot of decisions that guarantees the rights to land and resources and activities, but it's a very complex area because a lot of things that go to the court has to be proved and based on evidence and tracing a lot of proofs. So if we look at the UN defending Indigenous rights or creating a space for Indigenous peoples, it all started in 1990s when UN General Assembly said that it was International Year of World's Indigenous Peoples in 1993. And sometimes these notional or symbolic things are important as well. And since then, there has been 2 international decades of world's Indigenous peoples. One is 95 to 2004, and then 2005 to 14. And what it has done is accelerated the discussion about Indigenous peoples on the international stage around their human rights, about the environment, about development, education, health, economic and social development, lots of angles that people never thought that there would be unique aspects involving Indigenous peoples. And 2022, which is the year that we are in, is the decade of Indigenous languages. And I loved how you made John recite what he was saying in his language and what it means. And, you know, this conscious effort to understand and preserve the languages is really very heartwarming. And it's coming from all these efforts. Sometimes they come from top down and sometimes it comes from bottom up, right? So now I'm just going to go into the right of self-identification, which is not necessarily self-determination. So how do we know that someone is from Indigenous heritage? So the UN Declaration gives Indigenous peoples the choice to self-identify as Indigenous. And it's really important because there is, it's their right to be understood as members of certain customs and traditions being followed, and that becomes their identity. So that's really important, that self-identification. But a lot of things happened within the right-based system, that there was a denial of right to control their own development. And the international human rights law came into effect. And to a lot of people, we can relate to what is the experience of Indigenous peoples to the racial discrimination aspect of it, because we don't necessarily see what's happening to Indigenous peoples. But UN had the International Convention on elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And it was the most comprehensive instrument. It talks about racial discrimination. And it was adopted long back in 1965, but it was a next step, which allowed in 2007 the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And General Assembly of the UN adopted to this. And it's really important because it recognizes many rights that Indigenous peoples have. It has to be inclusive, and it's what is triggered or has said that Indigenous people's right under international law to have self-determination. So as I said, it was adopted by UN General Assembly in 2007. And unfortunately, at that time, Canada did not sign that. And it took almost up to 2016 for Canada to sign that. So what's the right of self-determination? It's very simple at one hand to understand, but it's very complex to enforce and implement. The Indigenous people's self-determination is the central right that's been recognized in this declaration, which is right to culture. And most of the speakers that you had were talking about it, having the traditional dances, language, a lot of ways of their life, how they resolve conflict, and many other things, even their fishing practices, many other ways of cultivating land, and how they raised the children, what were their values. Culture is a lot of things. And the right to culture, to preserve that, and their autonomy to decide what is their culture, because we can't interpret what's right in their culture. And understanding that and declaration of the UN, recognizing that was a big step. Within that is, of course, there is another aspect, that self-government in matter relating to their local affairs or internal affairs. But then what is their institutional structure? It's true that we have courts and justice system, but then they have band and they have their own structures as well. So what are their distinctive customs, even spirituality or traditions, their procedures and practices, their juridical system? Recognizing that is the inclusion of right of self-determination. So the legal rights would decide what it means, but I think there is understanding, again, as we said, there is difference between Aboriginal law and concept of Indigenous law as well. It's like a minute difference, but Aboriginal law is the law which the state defines in legislation around Indigenous peoples, but Indigenous law is stemming from customs. So we have to be careful. So there are 5 principles of self-determination. That's freedom, authority, support, responsibility, and confirmation. And I think that when we talk about Indigenous self-determination, and if we are actually understanding how we can bring it into our mediation practices, not necessarily in the court system, I think these principles would guide us. I'll repeat that: freedom, authority, support, responsibility, and confirmation. So I don't want to go so much into the details, but there is a cultural self-determination theory as well, which says that it's inherent human tendency to internalize and integrate social practices. So our culture is passed on from one generation to the other. That's how socialization occurs. And the research shows that it's important for not only Indigenous peoples, but for human beings, to see that what's the well-being and the right to make a decision or autonomy is the key. So I think that we need to understand that right of self-determination of Indigenous peoples, their feeling of well-being, their feeling of being respected depends on how we recognize and respect their traditions. And I think that's the connection between the two concepts. It's really crucial. So why do we think that self-determination is important? I think it is important to give them space. We talk about the self-determination as the right of the parties in mediation. And I want to connect the threads between mediation and the self-determination under the international law. But whatever are their social, cultural, or economic needs, it could be right to lands and territories and resources. Lots of conflicts that are happening around the world are happening with Indigenous peoples around the land and use of resources. There are lots of challenges when there is development happening, and Indigenous peoples would challenge that. It's because they see the land as something different than the world that's developing. What are the economic and social rights? Do they see that as a progress necessarily or not? And taking a pause and saying, what are we doing to the land which has been cultivated or protected for generations, and allowing them that cultural distinctiveness as defining feature is really key. We have to understand there has been a debate on international stage, and there was a lot of debate that was needed until from the individual right to collective rights phase, even with Indigenous peoples. UN was initially not including in the definition of it that Indigenous rights are collective rights. But now the declaration includes that it's a collective right as well as individual. So it is not necessarily that a person is from Indigenous background, but it's actually the collective identity, because that's how they perceive their identity. That's not necessarily maybe the law recognize someone's identity. And that's why we have to understand that the law has to adapt to what their perceptions and identities was, which was not reflected. And stemming from that, of course, then there are concepts of what non-discrimination means, or our understanding of equality. So if we say that our system has to be free and equal for all, then what does that mean to an Indigenous person whose identity is not just as an individual, but is collective as well? And then there are relations of the government with the treaty rights. And there are agreements between the states and the Indigenous peoples, and there are issues around its enforcement. So a lot of courts are interpreting different rights, and how it brings it all together for us as a practitioner. And I'll very briefly talk about some concepts which have allowed me to change the way I practice. And I would say that it's from the Indigenous teachings and my learning. Of course, I continue learning, but I think that intersectionality and trauma-informed way of practicing, recognizing the concept that people have multiple identities at the same times. And when we talk to individual who comes from Indigenous communities, you need to know a lot. It's not just the name of the person, where they come from, but they would talk about their clan, the band, and the language they speak. And sometimes it's in the context of being their identity as how they identify with various ways the band has recognized them. So there is understanding of trauma, which is really, really important. Every person defines their own trauma based on their lived experiences. So we have to be conscious about recognizing that some people on our tables, on our mediation tables, or whichever spaces we are working, might have suffered this trauma, which could be intergenerational, which may not be on the surface. And I think that we have to step up and build a new meaning to having renewed relationships with our Indigenous peoples. And I think that we have to continue exploring how can we bridge the gap between the Indigenous practices and the mainstream systems, maybe the justice system, but other systems where we make decisions about policies and otherwise procedures as well. So I think that's where I come from. This is what I would continue learning, and I think that we have obligation to be the best of ourselves by being humble.
Really nice, Archana. But the parts that you brought in, I think this aspect has not been discussed, and we need to really get into this, because finally it's going to come down to countries looking at their own constitutions and seeing whether they need to, one, if they already have support to Indigenous practices, good. But if they don't, what all are they looking at? And of course, with the declaration, where all they have obviously committed to, are they looking at developing that? But what about there's a ILO convention, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention. Did you have a look at that?
Yes, I have.
How do you look at that? I mean, because because not too many countries have ratified that. So,
I think it's very interesting. There are lots of conventions, and as I was talking about, even the declaration, sometimes there is a hesitancy in recognizing some of the international treaties and rectifying some of the things, because then there is an impact on being committed to making change on the ground, right? So there has to be, it's a lot of times the issue of having a political will, to be very frank. And it's not always possible that people who see that fit would be willing to take that next step and recognize, even notionally to start with and then legally, because once you ratify certain conventions, today or tomorrow, ultimately, if you say I'm committed to this larger goal, like ILO, then you need to really take action in the local, local in that sense, because you're talking about international aspects of it, right? So it means that there has to be will to bring those things into the national and local aspects of it. So there are lots of complexities when it comes to these relationships. It's not easy. And I think that at the very core of it, it is at the end of the day, the power dynamics, right? It's about who has power, and there has to be understanding of sometimes when the Indigenous community came forward and started talking about it. And I think storytelling is very powerful. And when they started talking about their experiences, stories, not necessarily demanding anything from sharing that story, just the painful stories of loss, it hit a lot of people. And that's why I think there is a discussion about what Indigenous peoples can do, but then what allies can do and what everyone can do together. And that's why I think it goes into our understanding of justice and fairness. So these stories move us. But then as an individual, it's easier for me to change what I do. But for the governments and for international bodies, consensus building and dialogue is a huge process that we have to go through, because people have to change how they view these rights to endorse those rights. So I think the next decade or so would be to focus on these discussions and bring that. And that's why I think that sometimes we have to look at the legal framework as well.
Because I think the thing is that mediators have a role to play in that consensus building. So like I said, there's this World Mediation Circle, and in that there'll be mediation circles. So one will be, which of course you'll be part of, is the Indigenous Peoples Mediation Circle. So there, let's, of course, with governments and all, we should start this. I mean, people will have their conversations in their countries, and on a larger level, let's do that. Because I think, I mean, look, changes are happening. You said in your Supreme Court, now you have an Indigenous person. I don't know whether you know about our president. Do you know about our president?
Yes, of course.
She's a tribal person. She's from a tribal community, and we had someone from the same tribal community in the symposium. Archana Tudu was there. She, of course, when she spoke about the practices in that community, it came out more as arbitration. I did not, but I've told her, please study it. Let's not take it as that, because I mean, I have this view that we have to look at mediation, but I'm not going to push it, because if it's not there, it's not there. Then we'll have to sensitize those communities. So we have a person from a tribal community as the president of our country, which is huge. I think it's huge. So that's big. So we have at least, I mean, that is one conversation we should be having, and that's important, because the colonization aspect of it, definitely lots of discussion around that, because if you talk about looking at the practices, then the colonizers view, and that even in the decolonization process, to say that is an inferior view of doing things. It's not, I mean, that's not, maybe not civilized, and all the other words that were used. I mean, those were things which people were conditioned with, saying that's what their practices are. So first, to break out of that mindset. So that, I think, maybe, I'm not saying everything is everything is a starting point. All of them are starting point, but I think that mindset which exists and that has been created, and you condition people over hundreds of years to believe that. So first, to be able to get over that and to look at it very objectively, looking at a practice that, look, does it make sense? Even in the basics, I mean, when you talk about today climate change and everything, sustainability and all, we see practices, sustainable practices available to us, and indigenous communities are doing it. Are we going to disregard it? Are we not going to learn from it? So same thing with the practices in relation to mediation, because I'm a little too focused. My whole thing is down to mediation aspect of it. So why should we not look at it objectively? And Ken also said, let's not take everything that the indigenous communities do. Let's, of course, look at it and see, because from the mediation perspective, like I said, if it's arbitration happening, let's say it's arbitration happening, and let's not just say because indigenous communities are doing it, so it's mediation. Let's not do that also. So I think we have to be fair in whatever way, but how are we going to do it? How to break out of that mindset and all? Is it going to be easy? I don't know. But this session of yours, I think, is also relevant in that symposium on the colonization, decolonization. So you have to give time for that, because I'm seeing a lot of overlap. And that I mean, I understood this before I announced the two, only because I don't know whether you heard me say that I want to hear the positive things right now, because the decolonization is quite a negative aspect of things. So let's look at least we know this is a positive thing we are starting with, and then how it was affected by colonization, and even today, even in the decolonization process, what's happening. So you have to have a similar nice presentation for us there, all research like you are doing. I like that. I mean, this is something which is very important. So of course, you said about the table, the mediation table, and something about the mediation table. I'm saying I'm moving from mediation table to mediation tree. I refer to it like that. So let's open it out. Let's open it out. Let's go beyond the table. So that's another aspect of it. So I think really interesting what you brought in, and I think the aspect of taking it up with government's part of it, I think we seriously need to do that instead of just the conversations within the community. I mean, in the mediators community, I think these things maybe we need to take a positive role in this, and maybe initiate these conversations in relation to these practices, and where all can fit into the law, and what has actually been done in countries. Because Kenya, you hear a lot of activity happening. Similarly, there will be others which will come out to us in this symposium or as we go along. So I think, Arjuna, I think really nice what you brought in, and I think we need to take it and develop it from there.
Thank you. I think this was really interesting to hear from lots of people, and it has, I'm sure, that shaped a lot of minds in a different way. So thank you. And of course, very well taken point that instead of mediation table, I'll start saying mediation tree, so that it's more like open space and circular table rather than that table, which feels like boxy and structured aspect of it. But thank you so much. I love the opportunity to think a little deeper on the topic, because I was going to present. So always appreciative of your efforts. I don't know how you manage this all alone, but it's great.
Well, I just love what I do and connecting with all of you. I think it's been really nice. But let me also put out, which I did not mention earlier, is that you were part of the conference, which took place in May and June. And of course, we had about 90 sessions. So Archana's session is there. You can go to mediatorvikram.com, click on this. The schedule is there. You can watch the recording of her session and all the others. So I had to, I forgot this when we were talking about it.
Oh, right.
So I think that there's a lot of work to be done. We just initiated certain conversations. We're talking about certain things, I think, but now we have to take it forward. So Indigenous peoples mediation circle, let's bring everyone who has already been part of this, let's bring them into the conversation and then grow that and get other people in, and then whoever else is interested to do work in that. That's how it's going to happen. That mediation circle aspect is going to happen from that end only. Take up a topic. So similarly with global climate change, we'll make a mediation circle there, and then whatever consensus building, dialogue and everything. So these people who are working on that specific area are available as resources for a lot of conversations that need to take place. So Archana, you want to give your concluding remarks or any whatever?
No, I think that I said a lot. Thank you for creating that space. And I think that the key aspect of the whole thing happening around us is there is a purpose to it. And the purpose is that we have to open up our hearts and minds. And I think that as a lawyer, I had a lot of unlearning, and I have no regrets of saying that. I think I have grown a lot since I let go some of the things, and it's important to be able to learn from Indigenous practices. And I'm still learning. It's just the beginning. And thank you for creating this space to share what people have learned so far.
And the interesting thing that came out, I don't know whether you saw Luis Ore's session. I keep saying that Luis Ore, what he's doing, because he gave out a whole case study of work that he did in Ecuador with a community affected by a mining project. And that work, I think, needs to go all around the world, because, I mean, this one is a successful case study is put across. And he mentioned work in Canada. This work is happening in Canada also. So let's take these case studies, put them, like he's already given his presentation that's available. The recording is there. Similarly, let's talk to these people who worked on this, and let's document this. And if it's a video, it can go out to governments, it can go out to relevant people there. Let them watch it themselves. I mean, to see that it works. It's not some theoretical thing. Some people are sitting somewhere in a symposium and talking about it. No, these are practical people on the ground. They've done work on this. So I think we need to really put that out in small sessions or whatever, that work that people have actually done.
I agree. I missed that session, but I would make sure I watch the recording. But I can actually see that there are lots of Indigenous speakers from Canada participating in this symposium. You had, I think, David and John, and Jim is coming today, and Laurelie. So it actually, even within Canada, there is representation of lots of corners of Canada that are being covered. So I appreciate that.
This is just this week. This week we have Canadian flag everywhere, and we have Mrs. Canada Globe also. So we have her also. So we have. I mean, I think from the Canadian perspective, is it because Canada has started looking at it seriously? Is it because of that people have become more aware? I don't know what the reason is, but I've got a lot of good response from Canada. This is only this week. I mean, this is this week. And I really find, I mean, like Girishji, what work he's doing in India with nomadic communities. So, I mean, there are people who are doing interesting work in India and everywhere. So let's look at it. I don't know how many people did we have from Canada the last week? Any idea?
I think you had Alicia. No, she was in first week. So you are talking about week 2?
Yeah, week 2. Whom do we have in week 2? We were supposed to have David, but David had some personal matter to deal with. Of course, John was there. So that was, of course, and Alicia in the first week. So we've had quite a lot of people. Perfect. Great. So thank you, Archana. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Jim is coming in 15 minutes. If you want to get into that session, please participate in that.
Oh, Jim is coming in 15 minutes, you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll definitely try to join for at least some initial part.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Always
All
a
right,
pleasure
thank you.
speaking to you, and I like that whole well-researched aspect of it, and I really like that aspect. So thank you very much.